Hey students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is slavery in the 13 colonies, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. All right, let's review some things that you learned over the past few days. England colonized North America, settling what we call the 13 colonies. There were 3 regions of colonies, with each region sharing certain characteristics. The southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, had a warm, humid climate that was excellent for growing crops, especially cash crops. Although slavery was practiced in all of the colonies, most slaves were taken to the southern colonies, where they were forced to grow these cash crops. A cash crop is a valuable crop that is grown for sale. And the main cash crops in the 13 colonies were tobacco, rice, and indigo. Indigo is a plant that can be used to make a blue dye. Now, I want you to notice that cotton is not on this list. Later on, after the colonists declared independence from England and formed the United States, cotton would also be grown in the southern states. But that's not until later, about 1800. In the 13 colonies, cotton was not being grown very much. The main cash crops were these 3: tobacco, rice, and indigo. Cash crops were grown on large commercial farms called plantations. Cash crops are labor intensive. That means that they require a lot of workers in order to be profitable. And to supply the workers, the British colonists began importing slaves from West Africa. I've noticed that students often think that slaves were Native Americans, but that is not true. Colonists did not enslave Native Americans for a few reasons. For one, Native Americans were familiar with the land and could easily run away from colonial settlements. A bigger reason is that Native Americans were dying in large numbers from diseases. The first British settlement in the 13 colonies was in a place called Jamestown in the colony of Virginia. And not long after the British settled Jamestown, the colonists began importing African slaves. The first slaves were taken to Jamestown in 1619 and forced to work raising crops like tobacco. The slave trade was part of a system called the triangle trade or triangular trade, and it's also called the transatlantic slave trade because it went across the Atlantic Ocean, transatlantic. It's called the triangle trade because it had 3 parts or stops, and here they are: the 13 colonies, England, and West Africa. At the first stop in the 13 colonies, raw materials like tobacco or sugar were shipped east across the Atlantic to the second stop, England. In England, those raw materials were processed and turned into manufactured goods like tobacco for pipes or rum, which is made of sugar. Then, those manufactured goods were sent to the third stop in West Africa, where they were traded for slaves. Here in West Africa, African slave traders sold other Africans to European slave traders. The slaves were men or women from other tribes who had been captured in raids or in warfare. And from West Africa, the Europeans shipped the slaves across the Atlantic to the colonies, back to the first stop, completing the triangle. In the 13 colonies, the slaves' labor was used to grow more cash crops, which would then be sent back to England, and the cycle would repeat. The leg of the journey between West Africa and the colonies, which involved the transportation of slaves, was called the Middle Passage. For slaves, the Middle Passage was long and difficult, and it must have felt like hell. The slaves, most of whom had lived their entire lives in the same small, intimate village, now found themselves chained on a ship crossing a huge ocean. They were packed tightly on boats, chained together, unable to move for weeks. Diseases spread easily in unsanitary conditions. Several million slaves died on the journey, never even making it to the New World. Once slaves arrived in the New World, they were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Slaves were expensive, about $1,000 each, which in today's money is about $30,000. The owners of plantations who could afford to buy slaves were wealthy and powerful men. The colonists lived in constant fear of slave revolts. By the time slavery ended in 1865, there had been over 250 slave revolts, first in the 13 colonies and then later in the United States. You're going to read about a slave revolt in class. Before we finish, I want to think about what it might have meant to be a slave. I find that students know that slavery is wrong, but they can't always articulate why. They say it's unfair, but they can't elaborate. What I really want you to do now is think about what it might be like to be owned by another person who sees you as just a means of making money. Take a second and imagine what it would be like to not be a human, but to be just a piece of property that someone else could do whatever they wanted with. The historian James Loewen helps us imagine this by identifying what he calls the 4 problems of slavery. And the first problem is a lack of free will. Slaves could not do what they wanted. They had to do whatever their owners told them to do. If they refused, the results could be deadly. And this lack of free will violates a basic human right of liberty. The second problem was the destruction of families. Slaves could not expect to have a family because family members could be sold off to other plantations at any moment. The idea of 2 people forming a couple, having children, and raising them to adulthood, this idea that we call family, just did not exist for generation upon generation of slaves. The third problem is violence, which slaves lived under the constant threat of. Slave owners could whip, mutilate, rape, or even kill their slaves without any consequence. They looked at slaves as property that could be disposed of in any way they wished. And the last problem is racism. The color line strictly divided America. The colonists were white, and the slaves were black. The only black people most whites knew were slaves. Whites saw slaves being treated as less than human, and they concluded that slaves really were less than human. They saw slaves wearing rags every day and concluded that they were unable to care for themselves. And they saw that slaves could not read or write, and they concluded that they were unintelligent. Then, when slavery ended, white people continued to hold these ideas about black people. Racism today is a consequence of ideas that began with slavery. All right, it's time to review the learning objectives. I especially want you to think about number 4. Review the 4 problems of slavery, and in your opinion, think about which one made life most difficult for slaves and why. If you don't know the answer to any of these objectives, just rewind the video and review them. And I will see you in class. Bye, students.